All right, welcome everybody to Launch with the List, or sometimes known as the bestseller list. This is the kickoff for Karen Hebert's new book, The Perfect Story. Wait, I want to get the subtitle right because it's really amazing. The Perfect Story, how to tell stories that inform, influence, and inspire, which is basically what we are all in the business of doing, no matter what you are doing all day long. Can you remember all the times that you were in conversation, in a room, in a meeting, and somebody's story has gone terribly awry? You don't want to be that person. Karen is a leadership coach, a trainer, a speaker, and is here to help us learn how to not have dead faces on the other side of our storytelling and to tell stories that land. And she's in conversation today with iconic, legendary journalist, media executive, and writer Carla Zanoni. I am thrilled to have them here. They are going to have a little chat, talk us through the book. I am going to post links to buy the book and social media you can share, because that's what we are here to do. And I'm going to step out of the way and we will do some Q&A as the conversation goes. So Carla, I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be with all of you. I was saying as you were coming into the room, it's so nice to have such familiar faces and warm faces. And I can't imagine a better space to welcome Karen's book into this world and celebrate what is really a very powerful piece of writing and information sharing that she's done. So hopefully we will have a conversation that's chock full of info. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my first real interaction with Karen. We were both listers. Karen is a TEDster. But I sent a note to the list in a bit of a panic last year. It was my first offsite with my team after the pandemic. So we had all gone hybrid. It was the first time I was going to meet a lot of people in person. And I was really reframing the kind of work we were doing. And Karen was incredibly gracious and reached out and took me through some thinking of how to really present and really lead in that kind of scenario. And when I went back and looked at the emails, I was laughing because Karen is a storyteller. Even in emails, she's telling stories. And after a really beautiful conversation, she followed up and kind of gave me this pep talk in email form, and it had to do with Sting. Karen, should I read just a little bit about what you wrote here? So Karen saw Sting. She was very disappointed after seeing this, icon. And she told, so I'll let her tell you a little bit about it. But the meaning of the story was really her trying to tell me that our teams, when they're looking for guidance, when they're looking for direction, when they're looking for leadership, storytelling is one of the most important pieces of being able to lead. And she said, just remember that your team wants to hear the story behind the songs. Sting had come up on stage, sang his songs, gave a cursory hello, gave a cursory good night, and was on and off stage and didn't really inspire. And so she has all of this to say. She has an amazing treasure trove of stories. And even in the most casual of conversations, she's always bringing that forward. And the book is chock full of that. So Karen, thank you for your leadership already. I'm excited to bring this to everyone here today.
I'm excited to talk with you. And the reason you got that Sting story after the conversation, I'm an introvert. I get my best ideas 10 minutes after we get off the phone.
So you're basically saying, it's never too late to share the story.
Never too late.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So Can I ask you a remedial question before we go deep? Because you really do go so deep. What is a story? Like, can you even just define that? Because we all talk about it. And, you know, as Anne was saying, we're all telling stories all the time, but it feels like maybe we need to take a step back and actually define what we mean by stories.
I think it can mean different things to different people, but there's an interview in there with Drew Dudley, who is another TED star. If you've ever seen Drew's talk, he does this 5-minute story called A Lollipop Moment that I'm not going to recount. It's hilarious. And I'm interviewing him for a vignette in the book, and he said that someone described a story to him as a basic unit of understanding. And I love that. Like, what a great way to encapsulate. It's not just a way of communicating, it's a way of like packaging up information and sharing understanding.
And you basically, you spend about 300 pages telling us why this is important and how to actually do it. But in a nutshell, why is that so incredibly important?
I feel like the most precious thing people give us is their attention. And why would we waste it like droning on or putting up pages of data or all of the offenses I saw? Before I opened my company, I was a head of culture in General Electric in a business of 90,000 employees in 150 countries. I've been a chief learning officer and I've worked in Deloitte as a head of leadership development. And I sat through so many meetings where I just wanted to pull out my eyelashes one by one because they could not have been more boring. They could not have had less information, communication, and understanding. And it was just such a waste. So if people are generous enough to give you their attention and focus, use it. Like, give people meaningful information and understanding.
And so once you have that attention, which all of us are clamoring in all of our different types of jobs in our personal lives, it's an attention economy, right? So when people are giving us that attention, how do you really go about making the best of that attention and providing them with this gift of the story? What are the first things that you start asking yourself to do that?
There's so many that right now my mind is thinking of two chunks. And so I'm going to give you both and you're going to choose our adventure, Carla. So one chunk is part of what I'm trying to do here that's different is evolve the conversation by helping people understand science and some new science that's happening when we're communicating or telling stories. But more importantly, what do you then do with that? What do you put in your story to make sure you're really engaging the audience? So that's one piece of understanding that part of it. The other is like the tactics of a story of, hey, I'm going to be telling a story in an hour. And where do I start? Which is not with the story and not with the idea. It's with starting with the audience. So choose our adventure. Where are we going?
Well, we're gonna go
Okay.
deep into both of these, but let's actually hit first on the first path that you were describing. So when you talk about the science of storytelling, I love you talked about the lazy brain. Can you explain to us what that means and why storytelling is so important in like reeling back that lazy brain?
Yeah, so to try to make the storytelling be accessible to people that may not have any insight on some of the science, I put together what I call the 5 factory settings of the brain. So if you think about your phone, it comes with these factory settings. Same thing happens when we are listening to information. And so there are 5 of these that lay out principles of what is the brain going to do? And then what do you actually need to do in a story to harness that? And the first one is that your brain is lazy. So if you come home from a day or you shut your computer after a long day and you're tired, whatever your comfort show is that you put on and binge, or whatever you do in those moments where your brain says like, oh, I don't want to think, that's because your brain is lazy. Our brain is using 20% of the body's calories, the most of any organ. And the majority of those are there to make predictions on how do I set my foot when I'm going downstairs. And so the brain never wants to go bankrupt of calories. Simple math. You run out of calories, you're no longer alive. So it's this miserly banker that's always looking to hoard calories and find moments where it can kind of step back and conserve calories. So when your brain drifts off in a meeting, or you are not really getting into a movie or a book, it's normal. This is when your brain is like, this is not worth the calorie spend. We're just going to take a step back. So what that means in a story or even a communication, if you are not making that person spend some calories by putting in unexpected events, really specific details, starting to engage their senses, it just washes over them. The brain like checks out, makes the mental grocery list, and the information's wasted. But you do start to put in these things, and they're the proverbial speed bump that your brain hits, and it's like, huh? Wait, I didn't expect that. Then you're making it pay attention, you're making a calorie spend, but you're also getting a greater result in the story. So I always encourage people that are new to storytelling, like, just even think, what would make the brain not be lazy in this moment, and try that, and they're immediately starting to tell some better stories.
So let's I like being able to go on two paths, because I think all of these things are interconnected. My audience development engagement heart leapt when I saw that you suggest actually starting with the question of who is the audience for this story. So, you were just talking about making sure that there are components of your story that's going to reel someone in, but there are different ways to reel in different audiences. I'm curious, so when you say start with the audience, what do you mean by that? And what are some of the tactics that we can apply to refine that message and then start thinking about how we're going to capture those lazy brains?
So when you're at a holiday table and your uncle starts telling the story that he loves to tell every year, like every holiday over and over, and it's at the point where you all can mouth along because you've heard this so much, he's not telling that story for you. He's telling that story for him. It's like his greatest hits, like, oh, time for me to tell my story. And there's nothing more boring and annoying in those moments, because it's not about you. And when stories just don't connect with you anyway, or they're really focused on the person, it's because they're telling the story they want to tell and not the story you need to hear. So when you have any opportunity to communicate or tell a story, you always want to start with that audience. Who are you talking to? What is it that you want them to feel? How are you trying to get them to think? What do you want them to know or do? Where's their mindset today? And what is an obstacle in trying to get that shift? Because until you get that, it's really hard to picture who's across the table from you that you're trying to talk to and communicate with. So even if you know the story you want to tell, grounding yourself in that helps you tell a more specific story so that person feels like you're talking to them.
Erin, I'm wondering, you talk about like building personas and thinking about the different types of audiences, especially when you perhaps have one story that you're planning to tell several different people. How do you go about doing that? So much of it sounds like it's truly built on empathy and what you perceive someone wants. What are the steps that you take to ensure that your gut actually reflects their needs and wants around that story?
It's the same thing you would do when you're doing marketing sessions. You start to think about, what are the demographics of the group I'm speaking to? What's their professional experience, their age range? Do they have families? Are they single? Where do they live? What are the things that just make up their day-to-day? And what are their interests? And if you were to map out a day in the life, what does that look like? Because it is truly trying to just build an understanding and empathy for, who am I trying to engage with? And it's not meant to be super lengthy. It's just trying to help you get a good image of who you're talking to and make sure your message lands better.
And then once you have that in place, how do you connect the dots? Like, first of all, I'm happy to hear that in your experience, you do kind of have a story in the back of your head. Sometimes it may come an opportunity where you're presented with the type of audience you're going to present to, and then you're coming up with a story. We'll talk about that in a moment. But oftentimes you do have this niggling sense of a story you want to tell, and then you're shaping it for the audience. How do you, once you have that defined, how do you connect the dots between the goals that you've set for telling this story, that audience, and then the best way to bring that story to life?
Yeah, once you have your audience, you want to pick an idea that you feel is going to best build whatever that is that you want to achieve. And so it's building a toolkit of these moments, these ideas, these things as you move through the world that fascinate you, and you start to go down it and you ask yourself, which one of these will help me help my team feel more trust in the direction where we're going. And you pick an idea and then you work it through a basic story structure. And there are so many structures, and I don't get too hung up on them. I mean, I feel like whatever works for you should be the one you use. The ones that often come up most in a popular way are things like the hero's journey, or even Pixar's storytelling model, which I think are fantastic if you're writing a screenplay or a novel. But I mostly work with people in the business world, and they're trying to land an idea in the meeting. And so they're trying to then take this idea they've chosen and back it into the structure of the hero's journey, and it just doesn't work. And the hero's journey forces you to tell the same type of story over and over. So instead, what I prefer to do is give people the structure I'll talk through in a moment, and then we weave in those 5 factory settings of the brain where you have different choices you can make within that structure and how you sequence a story to figure out how to make it most engaging for your audience.
And so I'm so glad that you are drawing that that tension between what we learn about storytelling for, as a novel or a screenplay, et cetera, because most of us are telling stories in business settings, perhaps writing a book, but it's a bit of a different setting. But the parameters are very similar. And you actually have laid out, I think it's 4 different parts of telling a story, like just as this framework. I think it's really important to just name that. How do you coach people to really think about that framework to set up the stories?
Yeah, so this is really the skeleton. And this is the thing that this is 5 minutes before a meeting. You can use it on the fly, or you can use it to really plan your stories. And it's writing on a sentence or two to get the basic structure, starting first with what's the context? What's the setting? Who's the audience? Like, who's involved, and why should your audience even care? You want to write an overarching sentence. It's not going to include every character, every event. It's just framing up what is this story about. Second is conflict. This is the fuel for the story. The moment you run out of conflict, you run out of story. And so this is something that needs to be resolved. It could be between 2 people. It could be between a person and an event. It could be between a person and their own values. But there's something that there's tension on that is needing resolution or needing some advancement. So you have context, conflict. Third is outcome. What happens as a result of the conflict? What action is taken? What is happening in there that we can see where the trajectory of the story is going? And then the last is takeaway. And this is meant to be the thematic, like, what is this story about? Why are you telling it? What do you want the audience to take away? And the reason for this is, if you can frame up the takeaway, you can then go back to what you mapped out for your audience and see, does the takeaway help me achieve what I said I wanted to achieve? Am I getting there? Am I sticking the landing? Because I find most often when stories fall apart, there's this great context and conflict and outcome, and there's really cool events, but the point of the story isn't clear. And so this is meant to take you through some steps to give you a basic structure. This is not the most dynamic, artful, amazing story ever, but it's going to help you organize what it is and give you places where you can then add on and layer.
So one of the things that you talk about that I really love is the place of emotion in exactly that structure you just described. And I think, one of the things that I've seen often is some people who like to give talks. There's a difference between engaging with the audience and really presenting the audience with a gift, which my experience, Chris Anderson always talked about, like, what is the gift that you are giving the audience? What's that energy exchange, which you talk about quite a bit. Emotion is often the catalyst for that gift, not just providing information. I'm wondering, in my experience with bringing emotion forward, it can be an incredibly vulnerable experience. And you talk about that in the book. What are some of the ways that you can bring forward that emotion, leverage that vulnerability to be more effective in delivering that message? I also just you know, at the beginning, you mentioned that you're an introvert, and here you are talking about how to present these things. All of these things
Yeah.
feel really connected. How do you make that work?
Yeah, spoiler alert, I read the book for me. So there's one question that I find is completely freeing anytime you're thinking about, do I share this? Do I post this? And remind me of the question, because before I get there, I do want to say, I work with a lot of people that get really nervous about sharing personal details, and storytelling is personal, 100% it's personal, but it's not private. You are not expected to share anything private, and everyone's going to have a different privacy barrier. And part of the process is figuring out what is private to you that you don't want to share. I was working with a woman on a C-suite team who she was asked to give this really big update. The team is all men, all a good 15 years older than her. And she said, like, here's what I want to talk about, but here's the thing, no personal stories. I don't want to talk about me. I don't want to talk about my family. I don't want to talk about my kids, because I feel like they're going to judge me for that. And for her, that was her boundary. And so stories are personal because there's a reason why you're telling them. You're bringing your perspective into it. And that's part of the gift that's being given. It is always personal, but it doesn't mean private. And so once you get clear on what is on the good side of personal for you and isn't making you feel like you're violating a boundary, you want to ask yourself, whom am I okay disappointing? Because sometimes we like think of all the people on the outside of the bell curve of, I'm talking to 100 people, but gosh, that one person, the I don't know, 99th person that's been just such a curmudgeonly miser is here, and now I'm like trying to change my whole presentation for them. You shouldn't, because that's one person out of 100. You want to be thinking about who is in the bell curve, who are you talking to, and who are you okay disappointing because they're not your audience. They're not meant to get your message. They're not specifically that person you're talking to. You are not for everyone. Your message won't resonate with everyone. And so I find asking that up front frees up a lot of that, so that when it does come, because it will come, it's like, yeah, okay, I expected that. That's fine.
Yeah, that I think that story in the book just resonated really profoundly. Just the ability to be able to say, okay, what is the part of me that is the truth, is incredibly honest, and I'm going to lead with that, whether or not we on paper demographically have something in common. We may be able to find common ground by sharing a story that is personal, that is the truth, and cut across those barriers. I'm wondering when you're feeling it, just really tactically, when you are feeling that level of insecurity, discomfort with vulnerability, what are some tactics that you would actually suggest for us to put in place before we step into that scenario?
I'm laughing at Anne's tattoo. So I half joke that I wrote this for me, but I face this all the time. We all do, because you, in the world that so many of us are in, we're in these very visible positions, or we're trying for very big things. And there's a piece of that that feels very exposing. And I find part of it is recognizing I've done the work for who I'm really trying to connect with here. And I have to trust that I've done that okay. And I've thought about who I'm okay disappointing. So now I just have to take action. You know, what happens most often when people are nervous for storytelling is I find some small way for them to tell a story, and then they get the amazing feedback and all of the oxytocin flows and everyone's feeling good. And they're like, this is amazing. Let's do it again. In the book, I talk about this story of like when I was 11 years old, I was at an amusement park, and it was a new roller coaster where you hung dangling from the thing instead of sitting in a car. And I kind of like roller coasters. Like I like having ridden them, but getting the nerve to go on them is a little anticipatory. And I am on it, and you're climbing up the hill, clank, 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 and you get right to the top where you hover right before you go down. And in that moment, I thought, like, what am I doing? And then you drop and you're on the ride, and that fear flies all the way over to the other end of the gauge to excitement. And I come crashing to a halt when you lurch to the stop. And I was like, let's go again. And that's the same exact thing that happens with stories of there is fear, there is discomfort, there is vulnerability. And when you get on the other side of it, it's also incredibly amazing. And so you just have to find different moments to try and see the response.
I just hearing you talking about roller coasters is like making me nervous. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. I want to talk about the 5 factory settings, but I really want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about what can go wrong when you're telling a story and how to come back, and how actually things, quote unquote, going wrong can actually be an amazing opportunity. So one of the things that you talk about is, and someone who you interviewed talks about forgetting your speech when you're giving the talk, right? So this is one of many of us have this fear. What do you do, and how do you actually make that into an incredible gift when you're on that stage? What happens?
Carla's poking my vulnerability right now because she's pointing out a story that like at the time was so mortifying and now is such a huge gift. So before I opened my company, was in General Electric, and Ted was piloting a new app for helping people in corporations learn how to give talks, be better speakers. And as a generous gift at the end of this, they asked people who were beta testers to come to TED headquarters and give feedback and, get the chance to see Ted, which I was like, absolutely, let's go. And amazingly enough, a week beforehand, I get a message from one of the people I'd been working with saying, would you like to give a talk on the TED stage? And I'm like, yeah, clearly in TED headquarters. Amazing. And I had 5 days. So I'm like, and it's crazy busy time at work. I'm like at the gym doing the speech in my head and in my car and in the New York Public Library the day before, trying to get it down. The day of I'm just counting down the moments to get on stage. And finally I get up there and I stand on the red circle and I take my turn, and it's being filmed and there's 200 people in the stadium seating and it's great. And I round the last third of the talk and like my brain just went blank. Nothing was there. I wasn't concerned. I was like, yeah, no big deal. It'll come to me. And I remembered something that I learned in improv, which was if you go blank, look someone in the eye. And my friend was in the second row. And so I looked her in the eye and nothing. And I'm like, it's all right. No big deal. Look someone else in the eye. Nothing. And so at this point, it's starting to become a little uncomfortable for everyone because it's not like, the 5-second blank. We're now like 15, 20 seconds in. And I remember the second rule of improv, which is fall on the floor. So I'm like looking at the red carpet under my feet thinking like, do I need to fake a fall here? And I just kind of put my hands together and looked down. And at that moment, the audience started applauding. And my brain said, I'm getting pity applause. Oh no. And it just kicked into gear. And I remembered where I was supposed to go. And I picked back up and I finished. But inside, like I'm dying because I'm a keynote speaker. I do speeches all the time. And I just blanked on the TED stage. And this is like mortifying. I just wanted to go hide. One of the TED employees came up to me and she said, I really liked your talk. And I was like, yeah, okay, thanks. You're just saying that to be nice. And she said, no, you recovered better than most people do. And I'm like, okay, like I'm just trying to get out of there. A week later, and I felt so mad because I just felt like I had messed up this opportunity and I hadn't built an idea, which is what TED is all about. So a week later, I am scrolling on LinkedIn and there's someone that had been there the week before that I had not met that had a quote from my talk. And I'm like,
so you
it's
don't
a
have any
week
calls. You're done at 2
later.
and then you're leaving.
It's a week later and this person still remembers this. And I thought, well, maybe it didn't go as bad as I thought. And then I was back at TED headquarters to give feedback in another session. I walk off the elevator and someone points at me and says another quote from my talk. And I'm like blown away because to me, I sucked big time. And this is the most mortifying public speaking event that's happened to me. And when I spoke to them, they said, I don't remember you blanking. I think they were lying, but the point was I had built this idea. TED very kindly takes you on a tour of the offices when you're there because everyone wants to see. And we go past this one section and someone said, and this is where we edit the talks. And I'm like, excuse me, what? They go, yeah, people blank, they lose their place, they have to step off stage, they get coughing fits. Like they're edited all the time just to make it easier to follow. And I realized, like, here I was beating myself up thinking I had failed when I was human. And by the way, the audience there responded to me because I was human and authentic. It's not awful to blank on stage. It's awful to then run away and never finish because you're going to wake up 13 years from now thinking this in your head at 1 a.m. But people respond to who you are and how you're communicating. They respond to you being real, not to you being the most eloquent, perfect speaker. So it's a uncomfortable thing to do, and we have this fear. But if you accept that you already have blanked, how many times have you been in the restaurant and the waiter comes and you're like, oh, I forgot my order, start at the other end of the table? Or you're, trying to give 3 points and you get to 2 and the third one goes away. Like, these moments happen all the time, and it's no big deal because we figure out how to move through them. Same exact thing happens in speaking. It's about just getting a basic game plan for what do you do when this happens. At the time, that was mortifying for me. And now it's like one of the best things that could have ever happened, because a year later, I got invited to give a talk at Purdue. And it was just such a different experience because I was like, I already blanked. It's no big deal. I can get up here and do this talk and enjoy it. And I did.
And the reason why I think that story is so incredibly important is there have been all sorts of studies that are showing that audiences are really hungry for diverse stories, particularly stories told by women that take on a new format, that take on a new way of engaging with the audience. And that kind of vulnerability and not striving for perfection, but instead striving for connection, whether it's looking at the person in the audience or, I think one of the suggestions you make is literally asking the audience, where did I leave off? Just as you would if you were telling friends a story. So that invitation to be vulnerable, to be a little more accessible, can take off some of the pressure. And I thought that was incredibly strong. Before I have a lightning round of quick questions that I want to ask you, but I want to make sure that we have a second to talk about those 5 factory settings that you had mentioned, and also want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. What do we need to know today about those 5 factory settings? And then obviously we can go into the book and go much deeper. But what do I need to know leaving this call about those settings?
Yeah, let me just take you through them at a high level. I'll tell you the 5, and then I'll give you what each of them mean. So first, we know the brain is lazy. The second is that it's going to make assumptions and predictions. The third is that it is storing information, and this information and experiences in this library of files. The fourth is that it's going to be filtering and looking for in groups and out groups where you feel connected and a part of something, or where you notice you're different. And then the last is that we get this fabulous neurochemical cocktail of things like oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin that help us seek pleasure and connection, and those that help us focus to get out of danger, like cortisol and adrenaline. So first one, we know the brain is lazy. It's always looking for these moments to save calories. And related to that is that the brain is going to be making assumptions. So if I put up an ink blot, you immediately are trying to make sense of what it is without me even asking you. Our brain hates for things to be incomplete, because the faster it decides what something is, the faster it can respond and not react. And so our brain is always making these predictions and assumptions, not just for how to move our body, but how we're deciphering information, how we're processing things. And what that means in a story is you want to slow down those assumptions sometimes. You want to put in the plot twist or some really specific details that are like, oh, that's a really particularly worded sentence. Like, I didn't expect that. Because together, when you slow down assumptions, you can make the brain spend some calories. Sometimes you want to lean into assumptions because you are helping leverage the way the person's already thinking. And so when you're telling a story, you're trying to work through, which is important. The library of files is a bit like when you take a photo on your phone and you swipe up and you can see the date, the location, the f-stop, the file size, how many megabytes, all of that. As soon as you take the photo, all of that is stamped on it. When we're taking information through our senses and we're having experiences, particularly emotional ones, they get stamped and stored in our long-term memory. this becomes this library of files. So when our brain is making these assumptions and predictions, it's going through this library of files of, do we know this? Have we done this? Is this related to something that we know? How can we use this to inform what we're doing? And what this means in storytelling is you want to connect to what people know. News channels do this anytime there's a natural disaster, like the Cathedral of Notre Dame, when it was on fire. What do they put on the news? They show you the fire, and then they show you a map of Paris, and they show you where the Eiffel Tower is, because they're trying to connect to what many people know of, okay, this is in Paris and I see how far. It's a subtle thing that we want to do in stories to connect to what people know and leverage understanding. So those three work together really well. The in and out groups are you telling a story where you want your audience to come away feeling like a member of an in group, where they feel a sense of belonging or shared values or something they aspire to, which is often what we're doing in sales, right? I want that. I'll have what she's having. Or are you doing what charities do and telling a story where someone feels noticeably different? You know, the Red Cross is sharing the story of the person whose home was destroyed in a natural disaster, and they're struggling to get food and clothing and electricity. And you're sitting in your home that's air conditioned, and you've got, you know, a bowl of fruit next to you, and you realize, oh, my circumstances are so different. And that can motivate you to do things. Sometimes you want to do both. In a job interview, you want to demonstrate where are you a member of an in group and a culture add or complement, but where are you also a member of the out group, where you're bringing different knowledge and experience that's going to move them forward. And then the last one, the cocktail of neurochemicals. Are you telling a feel-good story? Are you telling a story that makes people uncomfortable? The opening story of my TED Talk is about a woman dropping her phone down an elevator shaft and losing her driver's license, credit cards, badge, all of it. And it's a little like, you hear it and you think like, oh, that's awful. It's intentionally a little bit uncomfortable to take people to a different place. So these are just different things that allow for you to have levers to consider when you're telling a story that help you put specific things in, but also consider, what am I trying to have the audience experience, and how do I make sure I'm doing that when I'm building the story?
And the thread that I hear when you're describing all of this is the you, the focusing on the you of the audience, and really trying to put yourself as the speaker or the storyteller in their shoes, and really anticipating how they're going to feel, what they're going to take away from this. And that's just, to me, that's the most important piece of storytelling. And having worked with journalists for a really long time and storytellers, oftentimes it's the last thing that we think about. I am guilty of it myself. And I feel like that's just the most important takeaway from this conversation.
Can I turn the tables on you?
Oh,
I'm
goodness.
gonna mess you
Sure.
up. Well, I'm curious, because you are a journalist and a storyteller. What stood out to you in the book? Like, who would you recommend this to?
I mean, so many things. I think the biggest thing for me was the validation that emotions are perhaps one of the most important pieces of telling a story. We get so caught up in sharing the information as a journalist, or when writing creatively, trying to drive the plot, trying to drive the movement. And those things are really important, and you want to solidify that and be effective in telling it. But if you haven't helped someone to feel something, it's not memorable. We've all heard stories where you basically hear about somebody going to the grocery store and like all of the steps that they took, and it's incredibly linear and thorough, etc. And then immediately you're forgetting the details because it didn't move you to action. That, to me, it was a wonderful validation of that. On a personal level, it also reminded me that that's a superpower that I have, and that should be leveraged. So you inspired me in that way.
Well, it's a natural superpower. Good. Thank you.
Karen, I'm wondering, is there a perfect length to a story? One of the things, in my previous role, we were always talking about like the length of a talk. Should it be 8 minutes? Should it be 6 minutes, 18 minutes? What are your thoughts there?
I'd like to flip that, and it's less about the length and more about the structure and how well the story is put together. I do think there is some magic in the 18-minute limit that Ted has identified. But there are some comedians that will tell like a 15-minute joke story that you were like, and then what happened? Because it's just put together so well. And what they're doing is actually pulling on those 5 factory settings and building tension and putting in these unexpected things. So it's less the length and more, how are you putting it together in the way that is most meaningful for the audience? The best way to think about that is put together your story unabashedly. Don't edit yourself. Don't cut yourself. Don't worry about, is this right? Put it together, step away, and then come back, even if it's just 20 minutes, and ask yourself, does this earn its place? So the movie La La Land was directed by Damien Chazelle. Love the movie. The opening scene is this dance on the freeway in LA and a very colorful number. And at the end of it, you meet the 2 main characters. And after a year of filming and getting into the editing room, he thought, you know what, the scene doesn't work. It doesn't help. And so he took out every single musical number in the movie. And he said, each thing has to earn its place. It has to advance the characters. It has to help us understand or build to the tension or give us plot points that are meaningful. And so you can do the same thing. When you step away and come back, what you're really doing is asking, does this earn its place? Is it contributing value to the story, or is it here because I love it? Or is it, just going to add some humor to it? And once you really made sure things earn their place in the story and you have pulled on the factory settings, it's not the length that you have to worry about.
And so and please let us know if we should switch to Q&A. You just give me a sign.
Why don't you keep talking and we'll let people put some
Great.
questions in the thread. So everybody feel free to pop your questions in the chat.
Wonderful. We've spent some time talking about the professional setting, but you also talk about, personal scenarios where this comes up. So my brother just got married this weekend, being asked to give a toast at a wedding. To me, that's like the most terrifying ask. A eulogy, had to do that. Very difficult timing to need to do that. And you have really smart suggestions on how to prepare for that kind of ask in your life.
Yeah, and really the suggestions are just providing a different lens on how do you look at your audience. So the goal of both a eulogy and a toast is similar. You are trying to, fill the room with love. You are trying to share a story that people there may not know, because we all want to learn something new about the people. And you want to create this connection. And so when you start to look at it that way, if it's a eulogy, you can think about like, what is a story that helps people learn more about this person, but also is a story that maybe they haven't heard before, because that's a gift in that moment. Same thing happens in a toast. The difference is we're talking about looking forward and celebrating this couple, these people and their time together. And so it's really, again, what is it that we're trying to do and what is the goal here? And then how do you think of some ideas that can support that?
Carrie just put a question in here saying she's really excited to read the book. You had written, use your body to tell dynamic stories. What does that entail? Anything specific for women when thinking about using our bodies to tell stories?
There's many, from how you're using pause, pacing, cadence, inflection. But the one I want to give you today is, if you think of graphic designers that are drawing images of a speech real time, they somehow magically capture, they might do the light bulb with the 3 dashes on top for an idea and a brain for thinking. And you watch it and you're like, how do they do that? They're not making it up on the fly. They have their own vocabulary. They know what's going to be said and they know what this person talks about. And so they know, for these types of words, here are the images that I'm going to draw. You want to create your own vocabulary of gestures. You want to think about, what am I talking about and how do I reinforce that? So in my TED Talk, the opening story is someone walking into an elevator and I step forward and I talk about them pushing the button and I demonstrate pushing the button. When I talk about the phone falling, I use my hand to be the phone. And I even talk about the inspection certificate in the elevator and I put my hand up where it is. These are intentional choices to help punctuate what you're saying in the story. And it helps you have a little bit more purposeful movement. It also moves nervous energy around. So think about what you talk about. Think about what are ways you can reinforce what you're saying. Every word and sentence doesn't need it, but the more you incorporate those things, the more dynamic your stories become.
I'm so glad to see Julie's question here. She's interviewing for full-time roles, and her career coach recommended keeping answers to interview questions about 45 seconds each. That feels so short to me, and I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for telling a story in a short amount of time. Julie, I'm so glad you asked this question.
I do feel like 45 seconds is short. I also have an article I can send your way on storytelling for job interviews. Again, to me, it's less the time and more what you're saying. So in a job interview, you are building the interviewer's understanding of you, because if you don't, they're going to make their own assumptions. And so you want to be really dynamic in that. A couple of things that can help is think of 3 words or phrases that really dynamically describe who you are, and not that you're conscientious, but things that are really memorable. I might tell you that I'm the tour guide of storytelling, where I'm going to take you to new destinations and teach you things along the way. You want to come up with these 3 things because you're going to start to work them into your responses. So when you get asked, tell me about a time I'm like, yeah, you can think of me like a tour guide of storytelling. What you're trying to do is put in some specific things that are going to really help shape the person's understanding of you. The structure I prefer to respond to is not star. I'm not getting the exact words in my memory at the moment. It's similar to context, conflict, outcome. It's in the article, we'll get it. But the last one is, what did you learn? Because sharing what you learned is going to reinforce your own self-awareness, your own growth. It also allows for you to connect it to the role and what you're trying to do. I do agree you don't want to ramble. You want to keep it to roughly a minute, but I would hate for you to be thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm at 30 seconds, I'm at 32 seconds, I'm at 34 seconds, and have that impact your story. I would rather have you put together stories that have things in there that are vivid, that are going to make their brain spend some calories and are going to help you be memorable.
Related to that, Karen, what if you're telling a story and you see the audience or the interviewer's energy just like dipping? Are there things that you can do to reel them back in?
It's going to happen to everyone. And sometimes it's you, and sometimes it's they're hungry and they didn't sleep and you're fighting that. The best way to do it is to think of make them spend calories. Is there a really descriptive word or unexpected word that you can put in? Can you play with your cadence and the way you're talking that help increase the energy that you are giving so that they experience it? Can you ask a question back that then changes the energy a little bit?
I love that. We also have a question from Allison. Do you have any suggestions for getting more comfortable telling stories on video? She's had a podcast that's audio only, and now they're doing video, and it feels really fraught. Very relatable.
Yeah, Allison, do you mind sharing why it feels fraught, if you're comfortable?
Sure. I just generally hate being on video. I'm always the photographer, so I'm the one taking the pictures. And I just really find it distracting to watch myself talk.
Turn off your view of it for sure, because watching ourselves is very hard. I will often open a Word document and cover it up. If I can see the other person, I try to do that because I feel like that helps. Although so much of the time we're looking right into that camera eye. Cover yourself up. Remember, you are gesturing just like you are when you're standing. I will stand if I feel like my energy is a little low. Like today, I was like, we're standing. We're going to have a fun conversation with Carla. I'm going to feel a little more movement. Feel free to use gestures. I was watching myself on a podcast yesterday. I looked like I was playing piano. I was like doing things to like talk about different moments. Felt crazy awkward to me, but I feel like if you were watching it, it wouldn't feel that way. best thing is turn off your inner judge by eliminating what you can see of yourself.
Karen, I'm so glad that we had this time together, and I truly mean this. Everybody should get this book. It is so heartfelt and smart and really takes you exactly as Karen says. She is a tour guide through this process. It's incredibly, it's a fast read as well, I need to say, which is a skill in and of itself. And maybe we'll have to have another session just talking about how to write something where it's just so easily digestible. Kudos for this, and thank you so much to the list, and for having us, and Karen for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. You know, navigating the list can be tricky, keeping up with the posts and trying to figure out, do I respond to this? Do I not respond to this? So I'm the lister most likely to directly message you. And my best moments on the list are getting the chance to connect with people. And I'm just so grateful for all your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Carla. Watching you together was like a PhD in moderation and storytelling. Even if Karen, you weren't actually giving us information about telling stories, the way you told the story and the way you structured this session was masterful. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody for spending this hour with us. We are going to forward to everybody links for RSVPing to our next launches with the list. So stay tuned for those. We would love to see you again. As you know, we're producing some pretty excellent content. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to send you off to your 2 o'clock meetings. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.